What if the most important trade battle in North America wasn't really about tariffs at all? What if the headlines about steel, aluminum, and political negotiations were only the visible layer of a much deeper transformation one taking place inside supply chains, investment decisions, and the financial systems that connect two of the world's closest trading partners? For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada followed a remarkably stable pattern. Goods crossed the border with relatively little friction. Manufacturers built production networks that treated North America as a single industrial platform rather than two separate economies. Steel produced in one country could be processed in another, assembled somewhere else, and eventually sold across the continent. Businesses invested with the assumption that this system would remain predictable for years, if not decades. Then that assumption began to change. Not overnight, not because of a single speech or a dramatic policy announcement, but through a steady accumulation of uncertainty. Trade restrictions expanded. Industrial policy became more aggressive. Governments increasingly spoke about economic security alongside traditional free trade. Companies that once optimized purely for efficiency suddenly found themselves considering resilience, political risk, and supply-chain independence as equally important priorities. For investors, this presented an entirely different challenge. Markets are generally comfortable with bad news. They are even comfortable with higher costs if those costs can be measured. What markets struggle to price is uncertainty. When companies cannot predict what the rules will look like 6 months from now, long-term planning becomes significantly more difficult. Expansion projects slow. Investment decisions are delayed. Capital begins searching for environments that appear more stable. That process rarely attracts headlines, but over time, it changes entire industries. Steel provides one of the clearest examples, because steel is far more than another commodity. It sits at the foundation of construction, automobiles, energy infrastructure, heavy manufacturing, transportation, and national defense. Changes in the steel market ripple through almost every major industrial sector. When steel prices shift, manufacturers adjust. When supply chains change, investment follows. And when governments intervene, businesses often spend years adapting to the new reality. Throughout recent years, policymakers on both sides of the border increasingly argued that domestic industrial capacity had become a strategic asset rather than simply an economic one. Supporters of stronger trade protections argued that domestic producers needed greater security against international competition. They believed higher trade barriers would encourage investment, preserve manufacturing jobs, and strengthen national industrial resilience. Critics viewed the situation differently. They warned that while protection might help certain producers in the short term, it could also raise costs for downstream industries, complicate integrated supply chains, and encourage businesses to reorganize production in ways that governments never originally intended. Both arguments contained elements of truth, and that is precisely why the situation became so difficult to analyze. Because modern supply chains rarely operate within national borders alone. A single manufacturing project may involve raw materials from one country, processing in another, assembly in a third, and customers spread across multiple continents. Changing one part of that system rarely affects only one participant. The consequences spread throughout the entire network. As trade policies became more active, businesses quietly began asking questions that had rarely dominated boardroom discussions before. Should future investment remain concentrated in traditional manufacturing regions? Would political risk become a permanent part of financial planning? Could companies continue relying on highly integrated cross-border production if trade rules became increasingly unpredictable? Those questions did not produce immediate answers. Instead, they produced gradual adjustments. Some firms diversified suppliers. Others expanded domestic inventories. Some explored new export markets. Others delayed major capital expenditures until the policy environment became clearer. Individually, these decisions appeared routine. Collectively, they represented something much larger. The gradual reconfiguration of industrial strategy across North America. Financial markets eventually began noticing the pattern, not because of one dramatic event, but because multiple indicators started moving together. Investment recently discussed supply-chain resilience rather than simple production efficiency. Corporate earnings calls devoted more attention to geopolitical uncertainty. Manufacturing executives spoke less about maximizing short-term margins and more about ensuring long-term operational flexibility. The conversation itself had changed. Efficiency was no longer the only objective. Stability had become equally valuable. That shift fundamentally altered how businesses evaluated future investments. Projects once justified purely by cost savings were now examined through additional questions. Would facilities remain competitive if trade policy changed again? Could suppliers continue operating under new regulatory conditions? How exposed was each production network to political decisions outside the company's control? These were no longer theoretical discussions. They became central components of corporate strategy. And once businesses begin redesigning investment frameworks around political uncertainty, those decisions often persist long after the original dispute fades from the headlines. Perhaps the most important lesson from this period is that governments influence markets in more ways than through legislation alone. Expectations matter. Businesses react not only to current policy, but to what they believe future policy may become. If executives expect an environment of continued uncertainty, they often begin adapting before any additional rules are formally introduced. Financial markets behave in much the same way. They attempt to anticipate structural change rather than merely react to completed events. That is why the most significant developments frequently occur long before the broader public notices them. Factories are planned years in advance. Supply contracts extend across multiple business cycles. Infrastructure investments often require decades to generate full returns. Political announcements may dominate the daily news, but capital usually responds to much longer timelines. By the middle of this transformation, it had become increasingly clear that the conversation was no longer simply about tariffs. It was about something much larger. How should North America organize its industrial future? Should integration remain the dominant model, or should resilience and national production capacity take priority, even if doing so introduced higher costs and greater complexity? Neither governments nor markets had reached a definitive answer, but businesses were already making decisions as though that answer would shape the next generation of continental manufacturing. And once those decisions begin accumulating across thousands of companies, they create momentum that political negotiations alone cannot easily reverse. That is why understanding this story requires looking beyond individual policy announcements. The real transformation was happening beneath the surface in corporate planning departments, investment committees, logistics networks, and financial markets quietly adjusting to a world where economic security had become just as important as economic efficiency, and that shift may ultimately prove far more significant than any single tariff ever imposed. By the spring of 2026, the consequences of those competing strategies were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For American steel producers, the promise of long minus-term protection had started to collide with a much more complicated reality. Tariffs had indeed reduced foreign competition in some segments of the market, but they had also created higher input costs, disrupted established supply chains, and introduced a level of policy uncertainty that businesses found increasingly difficult to manage. Few companies illustrated that contradiction more clearly than Cleveland Minus Glyphs. Only a short time earlier, the company had made what appeared to be a logical strategic decision by acquiring Canadian steel producer Stelco. The vision was straightforward: combine production capacity on both sides of the border, strengthen North American manufacturing, and benefit from rising demand inside an increasingly protected continental market. Instead, the investment quickly became far more complicated. Because the United States had imposed steep tariffs on Canadian steel, Stelco's access to one of its most important export markets suddenly became far more restricted. A policy originally presented as protection for American steelmakers was now placing additional pressure on the Canadian subsidiary of one of America's own largest steel companies. The irony was difficult to ignore. Executives who had welcomed stronger trade barriers increasingly found themselves arguing for greater policy coordination rather than additional escalation. Instead of expanding opportunities, the new environment was creating friction inside what had previously functioned as one of North America's most integrated industrial supply chains. Financial results reflected those growing challenges. Revenue growth slowed. Profit expectations became more cautious. Investors who had once viewed tariffs as a straightforward advantage began asking a different question: what happens when protection also reduces flexibility? That question was not limited to one company. Across the broader industry, market reactions became noticeably more volatile. Whenever speculation emerged that Washington might soften tariff policies to reduce inflationary pressure, steel shares often weakened as investors anticipated renewed competition. When discussions shifted toward maintaining or expanding tariffs, prices sometimes recovered, but with far less enthusiasm than before. Instead of rewarding every announcement, markets had begun focusing on something much larger: policy uncertainty itself. For investors, uncertainty is often more damaging than unfavorable policy because uncertainty makes long minus-term planning far more difficult. At the same time, Canada was steadily reshaping its own industrial strategy. Rather than simply responding to each American tariff announcement, Ottawa expanded policies designed to strengthen domestic production while encouraging greater diversification of export markets. Canadian producers increasingly explored opportunities beyond their traditional dependence on the United States. European partnerships received greater attention. Domestic procurement became more prominent. Trade relationships inside existing North American agreements continued where practical, while exposure to future political disruption became a growing consideration for corporate planning. This gradual restructuring received far less media attention than tariff announcements themselves, yet inside financial markets, it was becoming one of the most significant developments of the entire dispute. Because once businesses begin redesigning supply chains, those decisions are rarely reversed overnight. Factories cannot be relocated with a press release. Investment strategies cannot be rebuilt every few weeks. Capital generally moves towards stability, and stability had become increasingly difficult to find. The situation grew even more complex during the spring of 2026. Additional American trade measures expanded the scope of existing restrictions while changing how certain duties were calculated. Some products that had previously benefited from limited exemptions suddenly faced different treatment. Companies that had spent months designing compliance strategies discovered that the rules themselves were continuing to evolve. Each adjustment required new legal reviews, new customs guidance, new accounting procedures, and new investment calculations. For manufacturers operating across borders, the issue was no longer simply the tariff rate. It was the inability to know which rules might still exist 6 months later. That uncertainty began influencing decisions far beyond the steel industry. Construction companies delayed purchases. Manufacturers reconsidered sourcing strategies. Investment committees added larger risk premiums to projects dependent on cross-border supply chains. What had started as a dispute over imported steel was gradually becoming a broader question about long-term industrial planning throughout North America. That broader picture became especially important as the scheduled review of the Continental Trade Agreement approached. For both governments, the negotiations represented much more than another diplomatic meeting. Washington entered the discussions arguing that tariffs had strengthened domestic industry and improved national economic security. Ottawa entered from an entirely different perspective. Canadian policymakers increasingly described the previous 18 months not simply as a trade dispute, but as an opportunity to reduce structural dependence on a single export market. That distinction mattered. One side viewed tariffs primarily as leverage. The other increasingly viewed them as a catalyst for economic diversification. Those different objectives meant that even successful negotiations would not automatically return the relationship to its previous form. Too many businesses had already adapted. Too many investment decisions had already been made. Too much capital had already shifted. By the middle of 2026, analysts following the sector were no longer asking whether tariffs had immediate effects. They clearly had. The more important question had become whether those effects would permanently reshape how North American industry organized itself. The answer remained uncertain. Some American producers continued benefiting from reduced import competition. Others struggled with higher costs and increasingly fragmented supply chains. Canadian companies faced their own challenges but were simultaneously accelerating efforts to expand beyond traditional commercial patterns. In other words, both countries were adapting but not necessarily toward each other. For investors, this changed the entire framework. The central issue was no longer quarterly earnings alone. It was whether the integrated manufacturing model that had defined North America for decades was beginning to evolve into something fundamentally different. That possibility explains why financial markets became increasingly sensitive to every policy signal. Because markets were no longer pricing individual tariff announcements. They were attempting to estimate the future architecture of continental trade itself. Steel happened to sit at the center of that debate. Not because steel is unique, but because it touches construction, automobiles, infrastructure, manufacturing, energy, and defense. Changes inside the steel industry rarely remain isolated. They spread throughout the broader economy. Looking back, the confrontation revealed something that extends far beyond one sector. Trade disputes are often presented as contests with clear winners and losers. Reality is usually far more complicated. Protection can strengthen some businesses while creating new pressures elsewhere. Retaliation can impose costs while simultaneously encouraging structural adaptation. Financial markets eventually recognize both sides of that equation, and once businesses begin redesigning investment strategies around a new environment, the consequences often outlast the political decisions that originally triggered them. As North America moves through the next stage of its economic relationship, the question is no longer whether tariffs changed the steel industry. They clearly did. The real question is whether those changes represent temporary disruption or the beginning of a much broader reorganization of how the continent produces, trades, and competes in the years ahead.